Welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longrie. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you from the Valley Access Studios out of Stillwater. Now, we are cable casting here in the month of May. Happy spring. And I have with me this month Mr. Loren Sederstrom, Councilman from the City of Grant. As part of our ongoing series and following the decisions being made in the City of Grant, we have Councilmember Sederstrom here on our program once a month. The City of Grant, they have their council meetings once a month. And so that's part of the reason why we have Councilman Sederstrom here once a month, because he can give us an update, and this month is no different. He has brought film footage from the recent City Council meeting that was held this month of May 2018, and is here to give us that update. So thank you, Councilmember Sederstrom, for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. We have a lot of things to go over. It's very interesting, and I think we'll dive right into it. We have a new attorney, you know, and there's been a problem with some interruptions as far as getting recognized and being able to speak. Especially the minority has difficulties, but the majority doesn't. And so one of the problems is there keeps being interruptions. So let's play the first clip, and we'll talk on the other side.
And what would you like to pull from the consent agenda? Very quickly, Larry.
Well, I'd like to get my second first.
Second?
Okay, I would like to pull the April City Council minutes.
Okay, hang on a second. Let's go ahead and ask the clerk whether or not she has...
I have the floor, and it seems like you just interrupted me. You asked me what I'd like to pull, and you seem to keep interrupting people, so...
Larry, if I may...
It works. No, you're interrupting,
Sir,
Jeff. That's
please.
the same thing.
I
The
just have a
attorney said
question.
we can't do that.
Okay.
And I said I have 3 items I'd like to have pulled.
Okay.
And
Minutes,
the
what
other,
else?
Item is the April bill list, and the other one is the E, cooperative agreement for the traffic signal at Manning Avenue and Settlers Way.
Okay. Let's start. You also know the process on this. You also know that we do action-only minutes. So the only valid thing you'd be able to change on the minutes would be your own votes and seconds. You know that, since they're action-only minutes. Of course, you wouldn't try to change anyone else's minutes, only your own, because that wouldn't be allowed. Kim, has Mr. Lelou approached you about changing his own minutes, his own votes or seconds on the minutes from last month?
Mayor and council members, the corrections that Councilmember Lanu submitted to the minutes are included in your packet.
They're included in the packet. And I actually went through and looked at those, Larry, and there is not one mention in there of either a first or a second that the clerk either wrote down incorrectly, or your second that you wrote down incorrectly, or a vote that was taken incorrectly. So I'm at a loss to understand how you're going to change minutes when they're action-only minutes when you haven't proposed any changes. So, moving on to the... Larry, I'm going to move on. Now it's my turn. Now it's my turn.
I still hadn't finished
Now
my
it's-
my
no, you
3
did,
items that
actually.
we had.
Councilmember Sederstrom, this is the first time I have ever heard this rule having to do with the correction of minutes, that you can only correct that part of the minutes that pertain to yourself. Now, I was a mayor of a large first-ring suburb here in the metropolitan area, and having gone through training for rules of parliamentary procedure, whether or not if it's Robert's Rules of Order or a variation of Robert's Rules of Order, I have never heard that rule, that in correcting the minutes, that a person who notices something that is incorrect can only make a correction if it pertains to himself or herself.
Well,
that is odd. That is really, I would like to know the basis for that rule.
Well, I can explain that. First of all, they keep changing the rules. We were sworn in on the 15th of January 2015. In December 2014, they had a new procedure manual. They changed everything. And they keep changing things as we go. Then they went to put things on, they went to action-only minutes, which means the clerk basically doesn't have to write anything down, doesn't have to write the comments. Unless you watch the meeting, you never know what's been said. They don't videotape public comment. And when she uses a one-word sentence to describe that, so you really don't get a flavor of what was said. And then they're getting to the point where you have to have them bring any topic up for a motion and discussion. Oh, you have to have a second, and then they decide whether or not they're going to put it on the agenda. So you cannot put anything in the agenda. You can't pull anything from the consent agenda, and they have 3 people. So they're basically, what they're doing is eliminating our participation.
Right. But my question is, ultimately, what was the correction that Councilmember Lanoux wanted to make to the minutes? None of us even know what that correction is.
That's
Do you?
right. Well, he had a number of minor corrections. He wanted to include other things in there that weren't necessarily action items.
I see. So he was actually trying to amend the minutes. then.
Amend the minutes
I
and
got it.
add some of the
Okay.
discussion and what was said.
Right,
But,
I got it, okay.
So,
Yeah,
okay.
that's very fascinating, but still, we even though what he was attempting to do was to amend those minutes to be more inclusive. I mean,
That's
that's what
right.
you're saying, is that he was trying to make them more inclusive, to put maybe the vote in context. That we have now heard what this new rule is, that in order to make a correction to minutes, that correction can only pertain to yourself. So the problem with that policy is this, is that if as a council member you notice that it was incorrectly noted that somebody abstained, let's say that they weren't at the meeting to be able to vote on the last meeting's minutes, for instance, that's a good example. And so let's say that they abstained, and it was them that abstained. But in the minutes, it says that they voted for the minutes. Well, that would be a correction to the minutes, but because you've noticed it, but it didn't pertain to you,
You couldn't
you
correct
could
it.
never correct it. And that is patently a very bad policy and rule to have for a city council.
Well, we're going to follow up in the rules because the attorney's getting involved. And let's play the next clip, and then you can talk on the other side. You'll find this very interesting.
Motion to add to the
regular
agenda.
Second.
Well, okay. Just a second.
Yep.
That was what we conventionally call an interruption. And this is April, this is May, that's the 3rd time since January that type of interruption has been made. We've adopted a new policy that says if there's going to be interruptions or speaking over or speaking before being recognized by the chair, then any further motion, suggestion, request by the person doing it, whoever it is, anybody on this council, is going to be rejected for that reason alone. That's an effort by council and staff to keep order. So with that in mind, I remind you of your newly adopted policy, and I remind you that you have to be recognized by the mayor before speaking. So let's go forward now, gentlemen.
Okay. Well, I will say this very clearly. I think no one can dispute it. Mr. Carr had a first on the table for the approval of the regular agenda. Does Mr. Carr have a second for the approval of that?
Second.
Mr. Sederstrom, go ahead and explain what happened there.
What happened is they were trying to pull things off the agenda. And what happened is Larry raised his hand without getting recognized, the mayor saying, "I recognize you, Larry," but he denied him. The attorney stepped in and said it was an interruption, but Carr also interrupted, but they went with his motion anyway, even though he wasn't recognized. So you see, it's pretty one-sided here. That's what's happening. It's one-sided, where they're doing everything they can to limit our participation. They want us to sit nice and raise our hand and be recognized, but Carr did not do that. He was racing with Larry to get the motion. And that's the point I wanted to make.
Right, and so Councilmember Larry Lanoux, he raised his hand, asking to be recognized, correct? Mm-hmm. And he was recognized.
No, he wasn't.
He wasn't recognized, but instead, Councilmember Carr, who didn't raise his hand
And wasn't recognized.
was then ultimately by de facto then recognized by the mayor because the mayor did not tell Councilmember Carr, "You're not recognized." But because they're buddies, he let him go forward.
That's right. That's exactly what happened.
Wow. I understand now. Those rules seem to be, like you said, one-sided.
Oh, the next clip, we're going to show you another example of that. So if we could play the next clip, we'll see who interrupts who this time.
Okay.
You assume that I did nothing. We sent requests to have things put on the agenda.
Yes, you did.
We've forwarded information on there.
You have.
We've had stuff to correct it. I assume we're going to have a race to the consent agenda before we say it, to have things pulled from the consent agenda. I want to caution our city attorney next time that I am interrupted by the mayor or the other council majorities to call them equally out, because I watched the last city tape. The only time he makes an issue is when the council minority seem to speak up. This is not a dictatorship, folks. And there are some pertinent issues that have come up, and they're worthy of having on the agenda for discussion. So I'll work them into the meeting later. You just go ahead and run your meeting like you have.
I just don't know how you're going to deal with this issue of interruptions when nobody follows the correct rule.
Well, that's the problem. Larry continually gets interrupted. They're saying you start getting putting an issue forth, you don't get a chance to complete your thoughts, and then you're interrupted by the mayor. He continually does that. Now we're going to kind of shift gears. We've covered interruptions 6 ways from Sunday, but you see how difficult it is to get your ideas across. You can't complete a whole thought. So now we're going to start talking about road repair. So if we can play that clip, please, on road repair, 617.
We did basically the same thing. We just did a overlay over the existing road. I drove that road today. And I also drove the road on Jamaica that we did probably 5, maybe 6 years ago, right in that neighborhood. That road going Jamaica south of 12 has 11 cracks in it. I realize in Minnesota, you're not going to avoid getting cracks across the road. That's a fact. But why is it the 2 roads that we did in the 2 sections, each of them having about 35 cracks in them? In other words, there's about 70 cracks coming from the 2 overlays we did between 2 to 3 years ago. And so are you informing the citizens that are doing that the life expectancy of just putting a quick overlay over a bad foundation, that they are, in my opinion, in fact, maybe you could give me your engineering opinion. Would you recommend that type of service to be done? And what is the lifespan that we're expecting out of this road by basically, we're putting a Band-Aid on it? I mean, you know, engineering standard, this is not what you would recommend, but maybe you can tell me that it's a good deal for the citizens, because looking at what's done already, I'm going to tell you, it's already failing.
Go ahead, answer the question.
Yeah, so Councilmember Lanu, we went through several options with the property owners abutting 65th Street, including a full-depth reclamation, a full street reconstruction, a mill and overlay, and because of price, they chose this option as the choice they wanted to go with. In my engineering opinion, I think it's an acceptable practice. It's going to extend the life of that street probably 10 to 15 years with general maintenance of filling the cracks. And that's something that needs to be done.
So let me follow up on one there.
He doesn't even answer the question that's asked. He's talking about the road, the cul-de-sac they're just putting an overlay on. What Mr. Ledoux was talking about is the feeder road Keats that comes up from Highway 36 that they're doing a third at a time. Well, what he's trying to point out, there was a redo on a Jamaica south of 12, and there's only 10 cracks in that. And that's as long as those 2 covers that they did, because they decided to do it in thirds. And there's 30 or 40 cracks in the stuff, so the quality isn't the same. And so first of all, the engineer isn't answering the right question. The second point is, he was talking about the people that requested to have their cul-de-sac done, and they're just doing a light overlay, and he thinks it's going to last 10 years. There isn't a chance. And in 5 to 7 years, it's going to be so cracked up because they're not even repairing the patches. There's potholes under there. So it's got a very poor base. And so it's interesting. You see the uphill flight. We're going to be talking more roads.
And I think that this really points out to, again, the lack of road policy in the city of Grant. That the current road policy, as I understand it, is that if a road is going to be done, generally speaking, it's up to those property owners that live along that road to say, yes, we're going to pony up the majority of the money in order to have it done. Whereas in retrospect, that doesn't seem to be a policy that works all that well, because if you're relying only upon those individuals living along that road because you have such large tracts of land, those folks, it's putting a very high burden on them to repair and maintain roads that everybody's using, not just the 7 of them, because everybody has the large acreage. And so I know one of the things that you have talked about is looking and changing at the paradigm of how your roads are paid for in the city of Grant and spreading it out more over the whole community. And how you would do that is to actually say, as a council, let's do an inventory of all of our roads, because some of our roads we want to keep dirt roads because you have a lot of horses and people are riding their horses.
Well, we did do an inventory, and so we have that. But what's interesting, there's 3 problems with this, okay? First of all, you don't give the people the choice of what they want to do when it's dictated by the condition of the road. The condition of this road is so poor that it really needed to be all the asphalt taken up and put back down again. Not a total reconstruct, but it needed that. Second of all, when it comes to road policy, the other thing is they have something called special projects. And if you happen to be one of the lucky ones on the road for the special project, guess what? You don't pay a dime. One of the special projects that's been on the list has been Joliet Avenue, or Joliet. Who lives on that avenue? Gee whiz, Carr and Huber. So they would get in scot-free. And again, it's the funding again and the way they do things. Let's go to the next clip and we're going to talk more roads. It gets real interesting here. They're very short-sighted, penny-wise and dollar-foolish, and we'll talk about that on the other side.
They had before, part of Keats Avenue, City of Grant doesn't own. That was brought out at the Valley Branch. So I don't know if we're addressing that issue. We could see the Valley Branch part of this because of the flooding. Have we addressed them and asked them, because we pay into the watershed, as when Mr. Waller came and spoke for the Rice Creek watershed, we should be asking our Valley Branch, our watersheds, for grant monies back, which could fund some of these, so that wouldn't come necessarily all out of our own pockets. Some of the deal that we are talking about, and we're not addressing the total project here, and that's where we're having a problem. We have a warning sign that was taken down last year and never put up. Wasn't put up all winter long. It's still laying in the ditch out there. We have an overhead wire. If you drive down that road and you have a large truck, it isn't legal. It's too low. So there's a lot of issues that are not properly being addressed. Now, if we were to go talk about the guardrail, last year, when we were talking about guardrail, we talked about mobilization. Should we have included that in the guardrail project we did last year? Because there was a $3,900 mobilization cost. Now we're looking at it, had we been prudent, maybe we would have included it last year. We would save the mobilization, because I gotta believe a good part of this, they're gonna charge us to mobilize again. If we take Keats Avenue, had we done that in one full suite, when we were going to, we broke it up in 3. We only did 2 of the 3, and we're going to spend $25,000. We told the citizens every year we're going to do that till it was done. Now, that short-sightedness is going to cost the citizens $45,000 to do that last piece. So we're, as a engineering and a council up here, we're failing our citizens quite a bit on here, because number one, don't own the road. We have all kinds of issues. Let's put them together all at one time. And maybe we should be looking at the parts that we did put, that mill and overlay. They're pretty rough. Maybe those are the ones that we should be pulling out of there and we maybe should take some of that out of our reserves. And I still recommend that we go to the Valley Branch, make sure. Now, we did pay our road contractor to come in there and put erosion control in there. We sloped the ditches, we put erosion control, we
Larry, I don't want to
put
be
seating in there.
rude, but you're on 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I still don't hear a question for the engineer.
Well, you don't want to be rude, but that's just the way it is. You're going to have to listen to some of the questions I have and said, can we look at this as a complete project, looked at everything? Because there are an awful lot before we move and pick this and make a motion. We should be going back to the Valley Branch and saying that both of those projects were caused by the water, not caused by the watershed, but as part of the watershed district.
If the watershed district has input on how to better maintain the control over the water and erosion that will ultimately protect the road quality, doesn't that make sense?
Well, what they had to do, Diana, is they had to raise the road about 2 feet, and then there was massive flood. This has happened multiple times, the flooding has happened. So Larry and I went to the Valley Creek branch watershed district, and we went to their meetings, and a bunch of people were complaining, and we should have been working with them because they have funding for that, and yes, it's emergency funding, but they collect funds, and they need to put some money back in. We had to raise the road. Luckily, they were very fortunate. We got some millings from the county, so it was a minimal expense. But we should be working with them. These guys aren't working with them. They never ask them for help. They just, so we're going to continue on. We're going to come back to this Keats issue, which was they doing a third at a time, you know. We're going to talk about that. That's what the next clip is about. So why don't we play that clip and we'll talk on the other side. This is beyond the copious of my diminutive comprehension how ignorant this approach is. By waiting a year, you waste $20,000. There's no way with interest and reserves that you could make that up. It's very simple. You know, it's kind of like going to the grocery store. You know, you don't spend the same amount of money each time. If there's a sale this week, you may buy a little extra things because you can save it next week. And that's exactly what we have to do. We have a very limited budget, and we have to be more astute in spending it. If we see an opportunity to save significant portions, that project almost doubled from $25,000 to $40,000. And Mr. Carr, down to $45,000, excuse me, Mr. Carr is, we can't spend it if we don't have it. Well, we do have it, and we could have been $20,000 ahead of the game, and there's no way would we get interest in 1 year to, what, we're gonna get $100 interest in 1 year? So it's very foolish not to be proactive. We have to be good stewards of the finances that we're dispensing. And if we have an opportunity to make our dollars stretch further rather than parsing it out. Well, we can't do it this year, we'll do it next year. Well, if it doubles the cost, and the same thing with the mobilization. We've got a couple of guardrails that haven't been done. It's $3,000 to $4,000 for them to go out and set up. If you do it all at once, you only pay it once. Why do you want to pay it twice? There's a lot of things that lack common sense that go on here.
Mm-hmm.
And this issue about the mobilization is a very important point, because again, I know from the time that I was mayor of Maplewood that we often, when we were doing road projects, we looked at if there was other projects close by that could be looped into the same time that we had the contractors out there, because they're already out there. This idea of mobilization is very important because it costs them time, money, and resources to come back out to the work site another year, another time, and that adds on additional costs. And if I have this correctly, this last third of this street that was being paved, that in the third year, that it cost twice as much as the third that was done the prior year. Now, is it a different size third? Is it under different conditions, or is it just simply because it's a year gone by?
Well, there's a number of problems. First of all, you should be sending bids out in January when the contractors are hungry and want to give you a good deal in work. If you wait until June, Their schedules are full. The only way that they're going to, come and do your project is if they can make some serious extra profit. They got to. So this was about a 1.5 mile stretch of road. It was $25,000 to do an overlay. So they do a third of it 1 year, a third of it second year, and then went to do the last third. And then the bid jumped to $45,000. Now there's 3 mobilization fees. They're spending $12,000 in mobilization. They could have saved $8,000 or over 10% of the whole project if they would have done it at once. Okay. Not only that, now they've last voted that they're not going to do this last third now. So the roads isn't going to get done. But there are a lot of issues. It's funny, they ran out of money supposedly. Of course, we have over $1 million reserve. So you would think you're not endangering the city that much if you spend an extra $25,000 in your reserves to get the job done. The same thing with the guardrails. They went around Woodpile Lake. They stopped 2/3 the way around because they only had $29,000 to spend, and it would cost another $38,000 totally to finish the whole guardrail. What was interesting about that particular case, since 1992, only 2 cars have went off the road by Woodpile Lake, and one of them went off on the north side where the lake isn't. So it's one of these projects they pull out of the air, decide to do something, and there isn't a prioritization, a logical prioritization. It would seem to me if it's a rural dirt road that people go slow on, you don't need, and there's no express need for a guardrail, why would you put it there? You should think about the main arteries where people are coming into their developments, like this Keats Avenue. It feeds into Indian Hills, and everybody travels that every day. They come out of their little loops, and that's what feeds onto Highway 36. So that's kind of what's happening there. I think we have 1 or 2 more clips on roads. So why don't we go to the next clip and we can talk on the other side. Okay, we have $1 million reserve. If we could save $20,000 of spending next year by spending it this year, there's no way the interest accruing on $25,000 is going to equal $20,000. And the analogy to a car, the only analogy with a car and a road is they both need maintenance. And, to take your analogy, are you going to repair your car when it's overhauled, or are you going to wait till the rod goes through the block and you have to buy a whole new engine? I'm saying we need preventative maintenance, and we can make these roads go longer, and we can spend less money. And that's what I'm trying to get to, spending less money, not installment payments.
Talking about this issue of maintenance, in the city of Grant, do they have, as part of their road policy, a seal coating project for the roads that have been newly constructed, say for instance, to seal coat them within 9 years of the new
Yes, they do.
construction?
Yes, they do. I've been out there since '92, and our road has been seal coated once, and it's due again this year, so it looks like it's every 10 years. But again, they approach this from what do we have in the piggy bank for special projects, not what the need is. What does the road need, okay? It's kind of like, well, I've only got a gallon of gas, and it's going to take me 2 gallons to get to the gas station, so I guess I'll just drive for what I have and push my car to the gas station. And that's the approach they take. They don't do logical planning. Yes, this year we may have to spend $50,000 more than we want to, but if that fixes the whole project, we don't kick the can down the road. We fix what needs to be fixed, and that's the problem. They have a terrible road policy. We need to raise the budget, and I suggested that last fall. It would have been $25 per 100,000 of value of houses, so it means most people would have went up $100, and we would have had enough funding to start fixing these failing roads, because some of them are very, very, very bad. Mm-hmm. And they're rated, and some of them are so bad they're not even going to repair them, so they just give up on them.
Wow. Now, I know that we have our next clip, so let's take a look at that.
Funding for roads here, so
We're
stick
talking
with
about
me.
Keats Avenue.
Yeah, and I'm just talking about not McCusick, I'm just talking about, in general, it said we applied for $1 million grant. I got a copy of that grant. we're being misled as citizens up here. It was a $462,000 grant. I got the documentation. It wasn't $1 million. We're being misled there.
I'm gonna
No,
stop
no, we're gonna talk
you.
about
No,
road
I'm gonna stop
funding.
you. We're talking about.
Councilmember Sederstrom, tell us a little background on this
Okay.
grant and what's this dispute about what the real grant amount is and what was published about what the grant is? Tell us a little
Well,
background.
what happened, they send a newsletter out, and we're not allowed to, council members aren't allowed to write anything in it anymore. But what they said, they were applying for $1 million grant.
And now who wrote that article?
It was written, I believe, by the city clerk who was included. They're applying for a grant of up to $1 million, okay? They didn't say up to, they said they were applying for $1 million grant. When Mr. Lanou got the specific grant specifics, it was $462,000, but it's rather misleading to say you're applying for $1 million grant when in fact it's a $462,000, but it was turned down. That was to fix McCusick Road, which is, we talked about in previous shows, that we had a way to fix it for about $200,000, and they wouldn't hear of it. And now they're spending probably $20,000 to $30,000 a year patching it.
And when you say they, you mean the council majority who's voted on these
Well,
patches but voted against the other?
They voted against the other, and they just have the people that do the patching go out and do it, and they submit a bill. So it's kind of loosey-goosey. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And if they have to patch more, then they have to take away more from special projects. So they have, I think they have $70,000 to $150,000 a year that they put into special projects, depending what they are. And there isn't any prioritization.
So now I want to clear up one question I have. Now this grant that was applied for the road repairs, who submitted that grant?
The engineer.
The engineer. And who works closely with the engineer when they have their staff meetings?
The administrator clerk.
Right. So she would have knowledge of that grant, correct?
Correct.
So she would have talked about that with the engineer at the staff meeting.
Correct.
And yet she's writing a letter or an article in the city newsletter that gives the wrong amount.
That's right. The newsletter comes out twice a year. I don't know why they didn't name a specific amount or said up to $1 million, but it just said they're applying for a grant that could be $1 million. Well, that is, it's just.
But that's my question though, is that if your grant has the lesser number on it,
That's what you should
that's
put.
what you've applied for. Because you're not going to get a grant for up to $1 million or $1 million if you've only requested $62,000. I mean, no one's going to give you more than you asked for.
Well, you applied for 462, so why don't we give you another 538,000 to go along with it? I don't think it works that way. But now we're doing some more road discussion where they have to putting semaphores in on Manning, which is County Road 15. And there's some questions of the one on Settlers Way, which is there's a development on the east side and there's nothing on the west side. And that's what this clip is about. So we'll play that and we'll talk on the other side.
15 and Settlers Way is a road to nowhere. If anybody goes there, you'll see that it has guardrails on there. Now, our city, in a safety issue, which is part of as we talked to the county, there was a bond that they had to execute to make sure that that road was put in there. And that's because the Axtell exit to get on and off of there is unsafe as it is today. Our city forced them to put together a bond, which is good for 3 years, to ensure that that road got placed in there. Right now, there's absolutely nothing there. I would ask that you look into it and say, why are we paying anything for a signal for a road that goes 20 feet and it's dirt? There is no road. And so I would ask that this body go back, research, and find why that bond was not executed and that road was not finished as part of that county project. I think we're still at a liability for on there, and my guess is that by now, your bond that you require them to get has probably been expired, so now it's on the ownership of the city of Grant to finish that.
Brad,
The Axtalls is on 12 and Manning. And they came through, and there was a big hubbub that the county said that their driveway wasn't safe, and so they put a stop sign in that comes in from Settlers Way, where there's a PDQ gas station and in some houses. Well, there's a stop sign there, but across the road where the new road was supposed to be, the new entrance to Axtall's, it's never been completed, so it goes 10 or 15 feet, then there's big cement barriers there, and there was a bond with this conditional use permit from a few years ago that was, in there, they had to put a so many $1,000 bond up to say that they would have the road done. It's been years past, and there's no road, nothing's been done, and so we're paying for a stoplight that we have no benefit of. I mean, we're paying for part of the maintenance or funding, which is only $300-400, but the point he was making is if they didn't complete the road like they were supposed to, they should forfeit the bond, and then the city could go ahead, take the money, and complete the road. And that's the problem. They lack a lot of follow-through is one
Right,
of the issues.
and generally speaking, that if you have a conditional use permit that has certain conditions to it, such as completing a road or putting up a bond, that those conditions, they don't go away until they've been executed, that they've been finished. And you talk about the lack of follow-through. This is actually something where, you know, a few months back, the city was looking at old conditional use permits. Well, this is one of those conditional use permits that should have been reviewed and should have been looked at to see what has to be done to make it finished.
What precipitated this was Manning was made a 4-lane divided highway up to County Road 12. And that's what precipitated them having to change the driveway. It could no longer go off 12 where it was, and the county and the city went together and said, okay, we're putting a stoplight at Settlers Way so you can go to the PDQ and get gas and groceries, but across the street that will also follow that, we want the entrance to Axtall's garden farm and a couple residences back there, but it was never done. And it was because of the road was reconfigured to 4-lane, and this was supposed to be going along with that, and basically the ball has been dropped. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I guess we're ready to go to the next one. We're getting out of roads now. We're going to be talking about some of these procedural changes we've alluded to a little earlier. So if we could play the next clip.
Not exist until after Mr. Sederstrom and I were elected to office and before we were sworn in. So it did not exist. We continually modify it to limit our participation as minority members. As we just talked about the newsletter, which has false information in it, councilmen no longer are allowed to write in it. This document is ever-changing to keep limiting our participation, just as agenda items. I brought forth great agenda items to be put on, and things happen between now and a month from now. If I've got to tell you what's going to happen 2 weeks from now so I can get approval at this council meeting to put it on next council meeting, it's ludicrous. I've made the application and put forth documentation to be included in the packet. I talked about our road policy so we could have an actual discussion. I've asked you to forward the road study and the road policy to all the council members so it could be discussed under new business. Right now, we've got a failing road policy. I mean, all you have to do is drive our roads to look at that, and maybe if the council would have read our road study, it's very good. So I'm telling you, this policy and procedures is nothing more than a exercise to limit the participation of the minority voice.
Well, I think he summed it up pretty well.
Yes, he did. He hit the nail on the head, and they continue to make these changes. We just voted on another procedural change this last time. Now they're saying that if you talk out of turn, none of your motions will be considered. So they're continuing to tighten the noose, so to speak. They're trying to limit it. Of course, the attorneys jumped on their bandwagon. It isn't working terribly well, but that's one of the points we wanted to make, that they've added some more language to the procedural changes. It's happening time and time again. So what they're basically trying to do is limit our participation to nothing.
Now, I have a question. and it has to do with this, is that when there's this new procedural change that you have just described, who initially proposed that procedural change? The clerk, the attorney, or one of the council members?
Well, the clerk and attorney have introduced it. I'm sure it's inspired by the mayor, Huber, but they keep refining and adding things to limit all the time.
So it originated then from the city clerk and the attorney working together to figure out how to limit what's going on at the meeting.
And it was never discussed under discussion. These things just magically appear. They haven't been on the discussion the previous month like they force us to do. We have to print things up. And you're going to see, we're going to be talking about 3M. I've talked about that. Now, we have to put that a month ahead to have on discussion, so maybe they talk about it next month, okay? Well, all of a sudden, these procedures and different things, even the censure of Larry when he was censured was never on the agenda, and it came out a full-blown document. So it's a one-way street here.
And the point that I want to make, though, in leading up to this, is that if it is being proposed by staff, which is where most proposals come from, and then it's on the agenda, staff can put whatever they want on the agenda. But if it's the first time, basically, that the council members have seen it, you would expect that there would be discussion points on it from all council members, not just the ones that are most affected, but those that aren't necessarily affected, that there would be some kind of questions or discussion or something from everyone. But the fact that there's little discussion by the majority makes me suspect that they've already been talking about it behind the scenes.
Well,
and that's the point that I think has to be considered in all this, is that you either have staff people who are individually consulting with each of these council members that they feel are in their pocket, so to speak, and that they're consulting with them and getting their buy-in prior to the meeting. So in fact, there is no need for discussion because they've got their 3 votes as staff. They've already counted their votes. They know they've got it because they've been working behind the scenes. Or it means that 3 council members are talking together behind the scenes and have signaled to the clerk or the city attorney in some way that they are all in agreement how this goes. Either way, it is a very non-transparent process to the rest of the community and to those minority voters on the council, because they're not even included in any of the discussion. And as you said, you're left out in the cold, not even knowing what's going to happen.
What's interesting is on discussion items, they have first thing that says staff discussion items. They didn't bring this up under staff discussion items and follow the policies and procedures of it being discussed first before it's put on the agenda. It shows up on the agenda, so they're not following their own rules, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But we have to follow the rules.
Yes.
And so that's kind of interesting. It works that way. And so this wasn't discussed. Didn't come up last month, which like it should have been.
Yeah.
It just showed up, and so that's what happened. But let's go to the next clip, and we'll talk on the other side. Mr. Carr's comments. I repeatedly put things in the agenda that are well documented, such the things I have today to talk about. 3 times I put complete background on hydrovac and even wrote 3 different amendments that were very similar to the 32-145 liquid waste and grant. So I, in fact, do completely document the things and provide you with the information to discuss. So I take exception that I'm throwing things in with no information. I've continually provided you folks with information, like I have today. So I don't appreciate the blanket statement of being accused that I'm not participating at a proper level.
And we know from your discussions on this program, all of the documentation that you have provided to the council in order to get something discussed, in order to see if it can actually get on the agenda for the next month.
Yes.
Hydrovacing being one of those topics.
Well, we're coming to something else now, which is very close. We're going to be talking about 3M because, you know, there was an $850 million settlement, and there were 2 dumps that were listed by the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. One was Bel Air Sanitation, and the other was actually called the 3M dump site. And interestingly enough, one was across the street from the other. The southwest corner of County Road 12 in Jamaica, if you drive by there, it's kind of, if you look, it's kind of unusual because you'll see about a 12-foot steel farm gate with 2 posts, and it says no trespassing, but there's no other fence around it. Why would there be a gate in the middle of a field that goes to nothing? Well, what it is, it's a remnant of the old 3M dump that they would dump things. They also would bring things to Bel Air Sanitation. And I went to a number of things that they put on, you know, little meetings where the DNR and the MPCA were talking about this $850 million 3M settlement, and I've signed up to be put on the committee. I also told them that, and I brought a flyer from there that said, it is for these cities, but not limited to Lake Elmo, Maplewood, Oakdale, et cetera, and they named 10 cities. Well, we have actually a dump that's named the 3M dump, and it's got an EPA number. So I brought that, I brought the flyer, and that's what I put, and we're going to be talking about this shortly. So that's what the next few clips are about.
So let's take a look at clip number 627.
You realize the DNR and the MPCA are administering the $850 million, right? And what I brought and put in the packet, and I'll read this so everyone can hear it. This area includes, but is not limited to, the cities of Afton, Cottage Grove, Lake Elmo, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So what we were saying is we should be included in that area because we have a bona fide they call it a 3M dump site. It's the southwest corner of Jamaica and County Road 12. And if you look there, you can still see the metal gate that they had in there, okay? And so what I'm saying is, what I'm pushing for is Grant should be able to get some of the funding to ensure that we don't have problems and it affects the health, safety, and welfare. I've attended multiple meetings. I've talked to the commissioners. I've talked to several of the people that are running it. I've applied to be in the committee. I've talked to Walker Smith that's down there. We're emailing back and forth. And I would like to have Grant get in the pool of this $850 million to see if in fact we have something, rather than ignore it and then 20 years down the road, oh my goodness, you know.
And I'll stop you there because you've laid out your concerns effectively. I understand your concern. It does say this area includes but is not limited to the cities of Afton, Cottage Grove, Lake Elmo, Newport, Oakdale, St. Paul Park, Woodbury, and townships of Great Cloud Island and West Lakeland. Now, when I look at the map to the right-hand side that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency put out, I see 3 different sites. I see the Washington County landfill in Lake Elmo. I see the 3M Woodbury disposal site down in southern Woodbury, right on the line of Cottage Grove and Woodbury. And then I see the 3M Cottage Grove facility in southern Cottage Grove. What I do not see is any site located in Grant. Now, if what you're saying is that there was some site located in Grant where PFCs were dumped, gentlemen, this is your chance to actually put together some proof that someone can actually read and understand.
I'm working with DNR and the MPCA and Rice Creek Watershed.
Okay.
Get this determined. This was a very, very old dump site.
I get you.
It was probably before.
I get you.
Okay.
So what you're saying then is you're still working to identify this issue. Is that
Well,
what
it's
you're saying? Is that
identified. It's
correct?
just we've identified the dump site. We're just trying to get them to, both Rice Creek and them to research it because we have documentation and
Gotcha.
we're working on.
Okay.
What I am puzzled by is that you are a council member that's really been out there trying to find the documentation, the paperwork, and yet you have city staff who can't lift their finger to do some of this work, and they're paid staff and an attorney and an engineer in order to help you and assist you and the residents of Grant to figure this out.
Well, they do nothing. Okay, they do absolutely nothing. I have given them the sheet with a picture of Bel Air Sanitation, the EPA Superfund site number for that. All right underneath it, it says 3M grant dump site, and it has the EPA number. I've handed it to him multiple times. He will not accept that documentation. I don't know if he wants the EPA bluebird to poop on his forehead or what, to punctuate it, but we already have the documentation to prove that it's there. It's got a number with the Environmental Protection Agency. He's accused us of making that number up. No matter what you do, you cannot convince them. They will not believe you, because if they decide they're not going to do anything, they're not going to do anything. And that's exactly what they're doing. Any idea that I come up with, they will fight tooth and nail. They'd cut their nose off to spite their face rather than agree with me.
Right. Now, Councilmember Larry Lanou had a few comments to add as well. So let's take a look at clip number 626.
At the Bel Air Sanitation site and the Grant 3M Township dump site was never done. And we'd asked that both Loren and myself have even applied for the advisory committee to sit on there to make sure that Grant is included in that settlement, so that we can determine if there were PFCs dumped in there, and if so, where they went.
Okay.
Recently spoke at the Rice Creek watershed, brought it to their attention. In fact, I believe that's what Mr. Zick was going to talk to you about this evening, was his input at the Rice Creek watershed, also seeking that Grant be included for the PFC testing in that settlement. So we seem to have asked him to leave there without knowing what he was going to speak about.
I think you're doing a fine job, Larry.
And so the next deal that I was hoping is that I was hoping that our attorney would give us some good sound legal advice. Seemed to tell me that I was accusing you of making false statements. I had never, I simply had asked to say, have clarification that it was not $1 million grant. Well, you can't get $1 million if you only have an improvement, it only costs $400,000 to do. They're not going to give you $1 million grant. So I was asking for the clarification because I think there's a lot in our road policy that's not clear and accurate. When we say all of our citizens pay for their own roads, just in Keats, that's not a true statement. If you're on a state.
Now we're coming down to the end of our program, but we want to give you an update on the hydrovac discussion that was at the city council meeting. So Councilmember Sederstrom, set this up.
Well, what happened is they basically called me a liar, said there wasn't a fine being made, and I said I would include it in the last packet. Actually, it was an administrative order for paying $3,450. So I guess technically it wasn't a fine, but it's an administrative order, and you write a check for $3,450, and that's what it is. So here is the interchange we have when I was sitting at the council talking about that. If you play that clip, please. Because I have the documentation from the MPCA, and if you want to put your money where your mouth is, I got $1,000. I will produce the documentation from the MPCA on the $3,450 fine.
Well, it's amazing.
I'd like.
Whoa. Settle down, people. Settle down. You know what? We're not going to be betting at the council table, Mr. Sederstrom. That's the type of rhetoric,
Liar.
sir. That's the type of rhetoric that's not helping any of us. It's not helping.
We have a copy of the cover letter that went together with the administrative penalty order. So let's bring up our PDF of the cover letter that was dated January 12, 2018 from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. It says, please read the APO, which is the administrative penalty order, carefully. You must take action within 30 days after you receive this letter. And then you see right there it says in bold, you must pay the enclosed invoice in the amount of $3,450. Now, you see, this is in association with the administrative penalty order, which we have right here. Now, we did not scan all of this to be able to allow you to read it, but this is a public document. And it is approximately, I think, about 8 pages long. And it also lists all the different corrective decisions that were made by the agency that they required the hydrovac company to complete. Now, it's fascinating in that there was an editorial in the paper saying that the writer of that editorial had talked to a particular Mr. Nisler of the MPCA, indicating that, oh, there wasn't any penalty order. Well, guess who signed this cover letter? But none other than Mr. Nisler of the MPCA, who says, this is, please see the attached administrative penalty order and pay the sum so listed on the paper. So, Mr. Sederstrom, I think that you've been certainly doing your part by producing the documentation.
Well, certainly, there was a letter to the editor by a planning commissioner, Robert Tufte, that basically called me a liar, said there was no fine, there was no, et cetera, et cetera. And it will be coming out in on Wednesday.
Your rebuttal letter.
My rebuttal letter with the documentation. I went in and met with the editor and said, I want a rebuttal letter. There are misinformation or false statements in there. And there's 7 or 8 things. And it'll be very interesting because, again, they paid $3,450 because they violated so many things. They were supposed to get a Browns Creek permit also, watershed district permit. I haven't heard how far that's gone, though I know they did come over and give me grief for digging my pond. But it's interesting when you're doing something that's helping nature, they give you grief, but if you're dumping hydrovac trucks, well, gee, you get a pass. We're talking about our environment and pollution, where you're talking about hydrovac trucks, or you're talking about the 3M settlement. I know some people at the, there's a association for Woodland Acres. They had a meeting last month, and a couple of people were very concerned because some of their water was starting to get murky. It wasn't like it was. So they even brought the flyer that I had put in the White Bear Press about hydrovac dumping in Grant. Mm-hmm. So this is a continuing story that's going to continue to evolve. It's going to be interesting next month to see whether or not they're even going to talk about this 3M thing, to see if it's on the agenda. I would bet that it is not going to be on the agenda. But I'll be going to Rice Creek Watershed on Monday, and we'll be seeing what action they're going to take. But
and I hope to have you back next month, and you can give us an update then on that meeting as you attend it, and we look forward to additional updates.
Well, thank you for all the help getting this out to the people.
Yes. And viewers, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Off the Record News. Bye-bye.
This is the dump site that was disturbed. As you can see, the slurry that was dumped this morning, and today's date is October 5th. Anyhow, it's this is Thursday of October. And you can see the slurry that was dumped this morning after the cease and desist letter was ordered. As you scan the area out here in this video, you can see the berms in the background. You can see the high lines. I'm going to pan over, catch the parking lot he installed. And he gravelled the parking lot so his trucks would not get stuck in here. This was not a casual deal. You can see the pit that was dug. You can see the extensive trenching that he has put in here. Actually, you can see we have the deer running through here now, the footprints. This is not a casual household activity. This is commercial in nature. This land goes on and on. There's not a single household deal. I am bringing you further down the line. You can see the pits that have been dug here. You can see how this goes on and on for acres. In the background, you may or may not catch a glimpse of a house back there. But this is the site, probably 5-6 acres in nature, and that's been dug up. You can see the water in the background.